When the new two-family house was finally finished, my mother-in-law looked at me with a cold smile and said, "You aren't needed here anymore, Dolores. We didn't even prepare a room for you, so please leave." Her words hit me like a slap, but I had seen this coming for a long time. I pretended to be shocked, my eyes widening as if this revelation had taken me by surprise. Inside, however, I felt no such shock. I had known that this day was inevitable, and I had mentally prepared myself for it. My husband, Stephen, had already handed me the divorce papers earlier, and I knew he had been waiting for just the right moment to present them. "Look, Dolores, here are the divorce papers," he said, his voice filled with triumph. He thrust them towards me, his eyes glittering with satisfaction. "The property will be divided, and I get this house," he added, his tone dripping with arrogance. He looked at me with a smug expression, waiting for me to break down, expecting tears and begging, but I didn't give him the satisfaction. I took a deep breath, kept my composure, and calmly accepted the papers with a soft, almost relieved smile. "I'm finally free," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. The weight of pretending for so long, of acting like everything was fine when it wasn't, had been exhausting. Stephen's eyes widened, and I could see the confusion and disbelief in his expression. He had expected a different reaction: anger, sadness, desperation. He had not expected me to be so composed, so calm. It threw him off balance. "Why are you acting like this? Aren't you upset? You're being thrown out and losing the house," he snapped, his voice rising as he tried to provoke me. He seemed almost desperate to see me react, to see me break. But I had decided long ago that I would not give him that satisfaction. I had kept my silence for years, but now it was time to reveal the truth. "My name is Dolores," I began, my voice steady, "and I'm 32 years old. I work as an employee in a company, and I have been married to Stephen for several years. From the moment we got married, I dreamed of building a home together. We lived in a small rented place, and I saved every penny I could with the hope of one day having a home to call our own." I paused, looking Stephen directly in the eye. "But it became clear to me over time that you never truly shared that dream, Stephen." My voice was calm, but each word was filled with the truth I had held back for so long. Stephen, self-employed in the transportation business, had always kept his finances a mystery. His income was unstable, and although he frequently boasted about how much he earned, claiming it was higher than mine, he never contributed meaningfully to our shared expenses. Whenever I brought up the idea of saving for our future, he would brush me off, using his family as an excuse. "My parents are struggling financially and I need to support them," he would say, making it sound like he was some kind of hero. His parents lived nearby, and his sister, who also lived with them, often came to visit, further complicating things. His family was always around, making demands that seemed never-ending. His sister, who worked from home, was a constant presence in our lives. She would show up for dinner several times a week, often complaining about what I had prepared. "Is this the same dish as yesterday?" "I want steak," she would say, her dissatisfaction evident in her tone. I would come home from work, exhausted, and prepare dinner, only to have my efforts dismissed as inadequate. And Stephen, he never stood up for me. He would simply shrug, as if her complaints were my problem to deal with. "Tell her directly if you have an issue," he would say dismissively, not realizing how his indifference cut me deeper than any of his sister's words. Then came the phone call that changed everything. My brother called to tell me that our father had been rushed to the hospital. He had collapsed at work, and his condition was critical. My mother had passed away years ago, and my father was all I had left. The thought of losing him too nearly broke me. I needed Stephen then. I needed his support. But when I called him, his response was cold and distant. "I'm busy, Dolores. Rushing over there won't change anything," he said, his voice devoid of any empathy. It was in that moment that I realized just how alone I truly was. My father's condition remained critical, and I began visiting the hospital every day after work. My time with my father was precious, and I wanted to be by his side. But this meant coming home late, which only angered my mother-in-law. "We'll be having dinner here from now on, so come back early," she ordered one evening, her voice filled with disdain. She had no sympathy for my situation, No understanding of what I was going through. It was clear that my visits to the hospital bothered her. She didn't like that I was prioritizing my father over her son and her demands. She even went as far as to suggest that I shouldn't bother visiting the hospital so often. After all, she said the nurses would take care of him. The demands from Stephen's family didn't stop. His parents and his sister began coming over for dinner every single night. I had to prepare meals for 3 extra people, even though I was emotionally and physically exhausted. My mother-in-law never missed an opportunity to criticize my cooking, always finding fault with something I had done. Stephen, of course, stayed silent, never defending me, never standing by my side. With each passing day, my resentment towards him grew. One evening, as I was getting ready to leave for the hospital, my mother-in-law made a snide remark. "Going to the hospital again? It's not like you being there will cure him," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Her words cut deep, but I chose to ignore her. However, my sister-in-law, who was sitting nearby, laughed and added, "She's probably hoping for a big inheritance by being there all the time." I felt my blood boil. How could they be so heartless? All I wanted was for my father to recover, but they were too selfish to see that. Despite my prayers, my father passed away a few weeks later. I was devastated. My brother and his wife took care of all the funeral arrangements, allowing me to stay by my father's side until the very end. Stephen, however, never once showed up. Not at the hospital, not at the funeral. When I called him to tell him that my father had died, his response was shocking. "I don't care about that. What about dinner? Come home quickly," he said before hanging up. My brother and his wife were furious at his behavior, and I felt nothing but regret for having married him. When I returned home after the funeral, Stephen greeted me with a smile. "Dolores, what did you inherit? I heard your father had a lot of real estate," he said, his eyes gleaming with greed. He hadn't come to the funeral, but now he was eager to know what I had received. I glared at him, my anger barely contained. "That's none of your business. And why didn't you come to the funeral?" I demanded, my voice trembling with rage. Stephen shrugged, his indifference infuriating me further. "I hate funerals. They're a hassle. But I'd like to know about the inheritance," he replied, ignoring my anger. I told him I hadn't inherited anything, though I knew that wasn't true. I just didn't want him to know anything. But Stephen wasn't satisfied with my answer. He even called my brother to ask about the inheritance. My brother was disgusted by his behavior and called me afterward. "Dolores, is Stephen really that desperate for money?" he asked. I apologized for Stephen's actions, feeling a deep sense of shame. After that, my brother and I decided to handle the inheritance without involving Stephen. We agreed on how to divide everything, and I trusted my brother completely. Stephen, however, kept pestering me. "What did you inherit, Dolores?" "Don't hide anything from me," he shouted one evening, his mother and sister chiming in as well. "If you inherited the house, share it with us," his mother demanded, while his sister added, "I'd prefer cash. I want to buy a nice apartment." Their greed was astounding. I kept my calm and told them, "I inherited a vacant lot and some cash, but why should I give it to you?" Stephen's mother and sister frowned, clearly disappointed. But Stephen suddenly suggested, "Let's build a duplex on the land. We could all live together. Wouldn't that be wonderful?" His mother and sister beamed at the idea, and I decided to play along. "Sure, let's build a duplex," I said, pretending to agree. I could see the excitement on their faces, but my heart was filled with anger. My brother and I had a plan, and I intended to follow through with it. Construction began, and Stephen's family was at the site almost every day, making decisions about the layout and design as if it were their house. I made it clear that I was the one providing the land and the funds, so I would decide the layout. They weren't happy about it, but they had no choice. I chose a standard layout, ensuring that the living areas were separate. My mother-in-law sarcastically remarked, "I'd rather not live with you, Dolores. Dividing the living spaces is better for us." I smiled and responded in a low voice, "Don't worry, we won't be living together." She didn't hear me, but my sister-in-law seemed puzzled and asked if I had said something. I denied it, and she let it go. As the house neared completion, Stephen and his family started shopping for new furniture and appliances. New houses need new furniture. Dolores, you should pay for it since it's your house, Stephen suggested, trying to make me cover the costs. I pretended to be apologetic. I'm sorry, but my funds are depleted. You'll have to handle the furniture and appliances, I said. Surprisingly, my mother-in-law agreed with me. Stephen, arrange the furniture yourself. Dolores has done enough by building the duplex, she said. It was hard not to laugh at her unexpected support. Finally, the day came when the duplex was ready. We went to inspect the new house, and my mother-in-law said with a malicious smile, Dolores, you aren't needed anymore. We didn't prepare a room for you. Stephen handed me the divorce papers, his sister adding, Stephen is remarrying, so there's no place for you here. They looked at me, expecting me to be devastated, but I smiled. I'm finally free, I said, my voice calm. Stephen's face turned pale with shock. Why are you acting like this? You're losing everything, he shouted. I looked at him with disdain. Divorcing a man who makes only $99,000 a year and has been unfaithful is the best thing that could happen to me, I said. Stephen still didn't seem to understand, but his mother and sister began to panic. Wait, $99,000 a year? That's not monthly? My mother-in-law exclaimed, and my sister-in-law's smile disappeared. Just then, my brother arrived, and I decided to reveal the truth. I found out about Stephen's affair because my brother had it investigated. I could have divorced him sooner, but I decided to wait for the perfect moment, I said, watching their shocked faces. Stephen tried to deny the affair, but my brother presented the evidence, and Stephen fell silent. My mother-in-law tried to argue. Even if Stephen cheated, there still needs to be a division of property. This house belongs to Stephen, she insisted. I clarified the facts. The land was inherited from my father, and the funds for construction came from my inheritance. The house is registered in my name, so it's not subject to property division. Stephen and his sister were clearly unsettled, realizing they would get nothing. Why didn't you tell me I wouldn't get the house? I promised my girlfriend a life in a new home, Stephen shouted. His sister added, I've already bought furniture for my new apartment. Now it's all wasted. I could barely contain my satisfaction as I watched their plans unravel. Stephen, worried about his debts, turned to his sister for support. You'll help with the repayments, right? He asked, but she turned pale and shook her head. The realization that they were in trouble dawned on them. I calmly told Stephen, given that you committed adultery, I'm claiming a division of property, and I'll also hold your affair partner responsible. Stephen tried to snatch the divorce papers from me, but my brother intervened. It's shameful to try to cancel the divorce after having an affair, my brother said firmly. We've already started the process for a claim through a lawyer, so be prepared. Stephen finally seemed to understand the seriousness of the situation, collapsing into a chair, defeated. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law, realizing they had no way to repay their debts, began to beg. Dolores, please help us. You're the only one we can rely on, my mother-in-law pleaded. I looked at them calmly and said, We are now strangers. I have no obligation to help you. They were at a loss for words, and my brother and I turned to leave. Suddenly, my usually quiet father-in-law spoke up. I'm getting a divorce too. I've always followed your mother's commands, but I can't stand it anymore, he said angrily. He left the house, leaving Stephen and his family in shock. Without my father-in-law's pension, they had no way to repay their debts. As I watched them scramble, I felt a sense of relief. My brother smiled at me. Everything went as planned, he said. I nodded, grateful for his help. Afterward, I filed the divorce papers and demanded a division of property from Stephen and his affair partner. My father-in-law eventually divorced my mother-in-law, leaving the family home. Stephen ended up moving back in with his mother after I left. Without me, he couldn't afford rent or living expenses. They struggled to make ends meet, relying on his mother's pension and his sister's meager income. His affair partner left him, unwilling to deal with his financial instability. They were stuck, burdened with debts they couldn't repay. As for me, I rented out the duplex. I moved into a small apartment, using the rental income to live comfortably. Sometimes, when I visited my brother and his wife, They would ask if I was thinking about remarrying. I've failed once. I'm not ready to go through that again, I would say. My brother understood, but his wife was optimistic. Don't worry, Dolores. Next time we'll find someone wonderful for you, she said with a smile. Deep down, I found myself looking forward to whatever the future held.